But just briefly, what do you think the current relationship between the US and the TPLF?
It's an interesting one, I would say, right? Because there's a long-standing relationship with the TPLF, and you also have to think the way to look at it perhaps is similar to let's say a country like Lebanon. Lebanon is fractured with power centers outside of the state, right? So Hezbollah is one power center, and there's other power centers in Lebanon. And some of them receive support from this country or that country, right? The US might support some groups, let's say, in the north that are, let's say, Sunni-based power centers. But they also support Rafiq Hariri and his group that take over the state, as an example, right? So I think what's happening in the context of Ethiopia...
that powerful to do anything, really?
Excuse me?
Do you think that TPLF is that powerful to do anything for the Americans at currently?
So the question is the utility, right? What's the utility? Obviously, if you occupy the state, you have much more power, the resources of the state, in order to actually engage in all types of actions, right? Including signing IMF loans and giving away your economic sovereignty, by the way, right? The way that the loans were structured pretty much renders economic sovereignty in Ethiopia, which is the space for the Ethiopian political elites to make decisions on how to go about, let's say, defeating poverty, right? That's now taken out of their hands and given to external power. So it depends on how useful you are. I think it's important to ask, what was the role of the US actually in supporting the reform process, the transition process? If you remember, the EPRDF was essentially fracturing. The four ethnic-based major parties were at each other's throat, so to speak. And what you had was an attempt to dethrone the TPLF, right, from within. So both the, let's say, the Amara and the Oromo, you had the kind of coming together in terms of political forces. Now, what's kind of interesting is that you also had an attempt to influence these groups in terms of the U.S. So, for instance, the prime minister is his family was in the U.S. He came himself to the U.S. He has told us many times that he provided information to U.S. administration as a intelligence official, right? He was the head of what's equivalent to, I guess, the NSA in this country, right? INSA. And so, and very openly about that in terms of providing information to the U.S. He's not the only one, by the way, right? And it's very odd because, in this country, in the United States, that would be considered something that one would be taken to the courts with, right? That's a very serious charge to do that.
Trouble if you did that.
Yes. But he was a known quantity, right? He was a known quantity for the U.S. In fact, I think they played a very important role in trying to stabilize Ethiopia and trying to have this working relationship, right? But that doesn't mean they have a complete power over it. I do know, I think, in terms of the war themselves, right? In the war themselves, there was I wouldn't say a green light, but I believe there was an acceptance, perhaps, right? Because the prime minister himself said, look, the war is only going to take about 2-3 weeks. I'll have it wrapped up, right? And that's for the war in Tigray, which took 2 years and hundreds of thousands of deaths and $20+ billion in terms of the economic hit that the country has taken. So in some ways, it wasn't necessarily objectionable, perhaps, right? But at the same time, they have a relationship with the TPLF. I think today the TPLF is in the throes of division, of trying to regain its footing, trying to regain its significance. And on a national level, it is not that powerful and it's not that significant, right? But it nevertheless remains a political organization of force, and with armed soldiers. With its power, by the way, over a region. One of the regions of Ethiopia is under its power. And so, yes, you can see the U.S. Administration, including the ambassador, visiting. And that's not necessarily a positive thing. When a U.S. ambassador visits, particularly in the context of the Civil War and the war that has happened, right? So this is about mending fences. It could be also used as a way of putting pressure on the central government in terms of Abiy. But otherwise, the prime minister has the backing of the West. He's going over backwards in terms of providing them with what they want, economically, diplomatically, and so you know, you're never permanent friends. This is not about friendship. It's about utility. If the prime minister is not useful today, he'll be thrown over tomorrow without a blink, right? And so that's really the nature of the game.
Great. Well, interesting. It's really sad about Africa. Every time you hear about what's happened in Africa, and it kind of really upset you. So I read an article very recently which says Africa practically feeding the world, yet remain poor. And it's quite convincing when you see everything, the figures and everything. And I don't know, one day I hope that's going to change. Coming back to our country politics, so the relationship between Somaliland and Ethiopian government now is bringing another war in, creating somehow instability in that region, and the government is just kept going on with it and determined to maintain it no matter what. But we know the Americans' interest in Somalia as well, kind of not very good, I think. What do you think the Americans or the US policy on this relationship? Do you think they want to support the government in this regard to have, so that the government, Ethiopian government, have some sort of war with the Somalian government, or do you think they're against it? Because I haven't heard much from them.
Yeah, I think in terms of public statements, it was to the effect actually of respecting Somali sovereignty. In fact, that's kind of embarrassing again for the Ethiopian government, because this is a key ally. But also other Western powers have also been in the same mindset, right? So the idea of the sacrosanct nature of sovereignty, of course, it's very selective, by the way, right? So this is part of the UN Charter. Article 2 of the UN Charter says the respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of every country. So Ethiopia is a signatory of the UN Charter. It's a member of the UN. So is the United States. Unfortunately, very powerful countries have taken this to liberty and have denigrated Article 2 and violated the sovereignty of different countries. But not every country has the right and the power to do so. So I think Ethiopia's case here, is very problematic because it really goes against that. It is violating the sovereignty of Somalia, right?
But can you trust America by just giving out the speech saying that they respect the sovereignty of the Somalia? If they were seriously against it, would the Ethiopian government have done it? Because we notice now things are changing because of pressure of the America on Ethiopia. Unless there's a slight green light, would their government, well, whenever they talked about it, unless there's a slightly green light from America, would the Ethiopian government gone through all this and kept going with the decision? Also, we know that Egypt seems to be a darling for America as well. So is America going to watch all these things? And what do you think?
Sometimes, and it is true, many US officials will say, look, we don't have all the power and we don't know everything. And that's very, very correct. In fact, that is actually one of the key lessons that we're seeing live on TV across the world. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor to the Biden administration, was in China, and it was absolutely embarrassing, right? Embarrassing in terms of the reception and the conduct, etc. There's no diplomacy happening. So that's a very important element, and I don't think we should not believe U.S. officials when they admit that. That's actually very true. And so the question from the U.S. perspective is actually how to retain U.S. influence and interest in a particular region, given that context, given the context that there's a lack of knowledge, given the context that there's a lack of even ability. So just give you an example. We're talking about Somalia, right? The most significant in our area that we're talking about, significant international shipping is Bab el Mandab through the Red Sea. The US and British Navy has just been defeated by one of the poorest countries in the Arab world, half a country, right? I mean, Yemen is great and we respect them, we love them. But just to show you the extent of the lack of ability, let's not, and this is something, by the way, that I think very honest military leaders in the United States have also expressed, right? The inability based on the techniques, based on the technology as well, right? Very interesting aspect regarding the democratic nature of new technology in terms of military warfare. Poor countries now have air forces, right? By simply putting together a few kits in terms of drones or missiles, etc. So I think that's an important element for us to understand here, right? I would also suggest that we also look from a perspective of what other actors play a very important role. One, I think, is the Ethiopian government itself. We should recognize that it has its own agency. In fact, Ethiopia has a very long tradition, irrespective of the regime type and irrespective of the personality. And I think that's part of the culture. Ethiopians constantly make decisions in their own interest, for their own plans, and for their own projects. So the first question I would say is, what is the plan in Ethiopia? Neighboring Sudan, in the midst of an incredible and brutal civil war. We just call it civil war, really, but it's a war of one against one, right? Uh, uh, um, rapid forces versus the military, essentially, in Khartoum, and the war is about power. It's not about breaking up Sudan and creating new states. In Ethiopia, that's the question, right? Many people, for instance, were very uncomfortable with the ethnic based system that was devised by the TPLF. They felt that the TPLF, as the dominant party within the coalition of EPRDF, perhaps was using it as a technique, not just of divide and rule, but if necessary, divide and make new states, and divide a new state called Tigray if things don't work out in the center, if you lose power in the center, as an example. That was a rhetoric, a narrative that we heard over and over again, right? It has some basis, but I think it's overblown, to be honest with you, right? Um, but the question now is, the dominant force in the PPP, the Prosperity Party, is also has its own political project. Is that political project to create new states, ethnic states, or is it to control the territorial integrity of Ethiopia and to create a new economy, a new political economy according to what they envision, etc.? That's a very important question that we have to ask. So from that perspective, when you look at the memorandum of understanding and when you're looking at the actions, foreign policy actions, it raises that question. Is this an act meant, for instance, to allow a facilitation of breaking up Ethiopia and perhaps creating states that can then, and this is actually from the politician Andargacho Tsigge, who gave an interview in Amharic, and I thought it was really on point, which was that if Ethiopia goes and recognizes Somaliland, the sovereignty, let's say, of Somaliland as a state, it actually is going against the grain. It would be the first. It creates a precedent, right? Just like, for instance, the TPLF, once it became the ruling state in Ethiopia, no other state has recognized a province as and allowed it to then facilitate its independence to become a country. Without that process, Eritrea today would have been like Somaliland, unrecognized. It could still be controlled. It cannot be part of Ethiopia in meaningful ways, but in terms of international law and legality and recognition, it would not be a state. So this is actually very pregnant, if you will, with possibility for groups that might be interested in creating their own states, right? You can see that if there is this precedent. The other thing I think, which is very important, is that there's other actors that are at play. So one of the interesting things, 2018, 2019 area, with this discussion about a new Horn of Africa, new security arrangement that was homegrown, right? Meaning that it is going to be based upon the interests, based upon regionalism, right? And that was considered by the preeminent foreign policy magazine, Foreign Affairs magazine in the United States. It was considered a threat. It was considered destabilizing to what? The order that's necessary for hegemony, right? So again, nationalism, resource nationalism was also be seen a threat. And so some of the actors that came in, the vacuum that was being filled because of the decline of let's say Western influence more broadly. Turkey becomes a very prominent player in the region. So do Arab countries. Like Saudi Arabia establishes a Red Sea Council in order to establish its interests in the Red Sea. Right. The United Arab Emirates begin its project to extend control of ports and sort of strategic areas in terms of military areas, right? Asab port in Ertra being one of them as an example. So what we find in terms of the memorandum of understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland is actually the hand of the United Arab Emirates. United Arab Emirates is a key partner of the Prosperity Party and Prime Minister Abiy. They're very key, by the way, in cementing that peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Saudi Arabia also played a role, but Eritrea was the one actually that had a long-standing relationship with the United Arab Emirates and was the one that facilitated the introduction and smoothing the introduction of Ethiopia's new and young prime minister at that time. From that time onwards, the UAE has played a very important role in directly subsidizing Ethiopia's budget to the tune of several $billions. They've also played a very important role in promising and I think delivering on some of it, investing in real estate speculation, particularly within Addis Ababa. So here we go back, maybe to a different conversation regarding land grabs, regarding
Absolutely.
right. So the element here of foreign investment, right, particularly privileging the UAE is very important, and it's beneficial to again bringing in some funds, sort of making Addis splashy, so on and so forth. Concretely, though, the Ethiopian government of Abiy Ahmed also has played a very important role in pushing the UAE's political agenda within the Horn of Africa, broader Horn of Africa. So, for instance, you have support for the rapid defense forces in Sudan. So the I wouldn't want to call him warlord, although he started off in Darfur as part of a counterinsurgency movement in Darfur that was funded by the Sudanese government of al-Bashir. If you remember the Darfur war and conflict that some described as a genocide, but really was mass atrocity and massacres that was happening in Darfur, part of it was the counterinsurgency project of of Khartoum. And so his start from a kind of a militia leader to now a general, his brother owns and controls gold mining in Darfur. For those that may not know, Sudan has been, from ancient times to today, essentially a land sitting on gold. And so that gold is smuggled outside of of Sudan, through informal channels to Dubai. Ethiopia's gold, which doesn't show up in its export ledger anymore in significant fashion, is also being siphoned off from Western region, from Asosa, in Benishangul Gumuz,
Right, well.
and it shows up in Dubai. So one element is to try to funnel, particularly gold, to Dubai, and to create kind of chaos. So the United Arab Emirates is involved in Libya, in sort of the dividing of that between different powers. It is part of funding this humongous destructive war in the Sudan. And in order to do that, Ethiopia is playing a very pivotal role. Certain airports in western part of Ethiopia have been made available for quite some time to fly in and fly out weapons to these groups. In Chad, there's a particular airport, again, that was designed, built, where you have direct flights from the UAE. You can actually go online and track some of these planes. And again, to smuggle those weapons into the conflict in Sudan. So that's one element that current government of Ethiopia is playing, right, in the region in support of the UAE. The other one is this port agreement as well, right? So, I would say that there's a push because the promise from the UAE is to fund. The UAE doesn't have a population. They don't have enough for a navy, right? And so again, it's Ethiopians that are going to create the bodies necessary to create a navy, but the funds are available. So part of that is the creation of a navy, an Ethiopian navy funded by the UAE and kind of driving UAE interest. And I think that's one way to look at that. And many are very shocked by this because they think of the UAE as a small country, not even two neighborhoods in Addis have
Yes,
more.
but with a lot of money, which is
Yes,
power.
yes. But that's not the way you should look at it. Companies, multinational companies, have more power than some states, and so the UAE is a very powerful actor globally, and so it's not about isolating oneself from any type of relationship, but it's about having a relationship that, for instance, does not require the destabilization of neighbors such as Sudan, does not require the trampling of sovereignty of Somalia, does not also, by the way, and the UAE is very important in funneling, funding, and supporting the continual drive of war in northern Ethiopia. So remember, at the end of the day, um, you know, everyone that died was Ethiopian,
True.
and what should have happened was peace as quickly and as fast as possible. And from both sides, you can, of course, the TPLF, why didn't they sue for peace? You can ask all types of questions. But the government, remember, is a legitimate authority. And you can ask also, how is it able that they had this appetite for constant war and constant war, where they're getting the funding from, right? Because if you don't have funding, there's no war. In fact, your appetite is to quickly go towards negotiations. There's an interesting book called Abi's Project. And I think in that book,
Mm.
there's an interesting set of um, narrative that looks at the unwillingness of the prime minister to engage in any type of dialogue or negotiations in order to stop the war, right? His thought was total victory. He had to have total victory. And that's why, to a certain extent, there was a prolongation of that war. And eventually they ended up negotiating, signing, and you had peace. But how many hundreds of thousands could have survived? So for us, I think that's also one way to think about this relationship with the UAE having multiple damaging consequences, even making to a certain extent the Ethiopian government irresponsible and unaccountable even towards its own national interest, right? Assuming, for instance, we don't think, as the politician Andargacho Tsege has said, that there's perhaps an agenda, right? A political agenda, not some sort of mysterious agenda, but a political agenda. Just like, for instance, the TPLF came out during particularly the war saying they want to create, they might secede. They have a right to secede according to the Ethiopian constitution. So these types of conversations, some political bodies have it in Ethiopia, but does the government that rule the country have it? And if so, are they using the power, the resources, the diplomatic investment of generations of Ethiopians? Are they using all those to actually destroy Ethiopia and create a small sort of state of their own, right? And I think that's again, it's
Well, it
speculative.
is. It is actually interesting because I was saying that yesterday because we have seen all the reasons, and Ethiopia as a country is not going to benefit from all these wars or all this conflict unless you have a plan, to destabilize the country, which probably helps your new project of your new state. So if you want to be a powerful government, and if you want to be a government of a country, then you don't destroy that country. So I was thinking exactly the same. However, but I don't know if the Americans actually quite happy with the relationship of Dr. Abiy with United Arab Emirates. Are they not feeling threatened or anything like that?
Not necessarily. So the relationship, remember, the United Arab Emirates itself is a client state. Their funds are controlled, are in Western financial system. Just yesterday, the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, his plane was taken, was essentially just taken, right? It's
Yeah.
called theft, in other words, right? Um,
Yeah.
so, in terms of international finance, many states, and I think an illustrative one is the Russian Federation having about $400 billion within Western financial institutions, and those monies were actually taken. They were frozen. They were not given. And the indication for all those that have money within the Western financial system was actually that your money's not safe, that there are no rules, legal contracts that can protect you and your rights. This is a huge, by the way, blunder. An enemy couldn't even think of doing worse to you. Um, so I think if you can remind me, actually, just to go back to your
Yes, I
point.
was just wondering that closeness with Dr. Abiy, Ethiopian Prime Minister with the United Arab.
Yes. So
Yes,
it's not, you can have closeness, etc., but there's other actors that are playing sort of their own interests, right? The UAE does its own actions all over West Asia, right? In Yemen, in Syria, earlier on in Lebanon. So in major issues, yes. So just ask yourself today, where is the UAE with respect to Gaza? Where's
exactly.
Saudi Arabia with
Yeah,
respect to Gaza?
true, true.
Okay, so there's certain red lines that they cannot cross, but there's a significant amount of leeway where they have the ability to go after their own interests. As an example, the CEO of Telegram, which many of your users probably use it, many of your viewers probably use it, was arrested in France. Now he's out on bail after a few days. The UAE canceled, I believe it's $20 billion or some 80 fighter jets from France as a response to that arrest. UAE is a major investor in Telegram, right? So UAE has its own interests. It plays a role in terms of international politics, international finance, etc. So there is that, but it just doesn't cross certain red lines. Just
Great.
to let you know as well, if I can just point out, one of the key aspects has been from the U.S. perspective. Just to give you an illustration, has been to contain Iran, right? To starve it. So this is the technique of sanctioning. But Iran essentially uses UAE as its banking center, and everybody knows that. So that's just to give you an illustration that no, this is the U.S. interest in Ethiopia is to have a stable government, a strong state that's able to perform and achieve some of its objectives that's necessary for the U.S. interest. One, for instance, is not to get too close to China, right? Not to be a key participant in the Belt and Road Initiative. The China Africa Cooperation Forum, which is being held, I believe today until, no, September 4th until September 6th, right?
Mm.
Is an incredible set of forums that periodically reiterate the importance of Chinese infrastructural investment
Yeah.
and Chinese interest in industrializing Africa. So
Okay,
on the
that actually
agenda,
leads me to my next question. Um, yes, we cannot be naive and say, well, the West is too dangerous to have any relationship, but it's part of the world. We should obviously have relationship. Can we actually build a relationship that's genuine, that we're not slaves to their interest, and we can also have relationship so that we are also benefit from that relationship?
yeah, so it's a really interesting, question, really, and I can pose it as this: um, does a relationship have to be zero sum, or can it be win-win? So, on an international level today, this whole discussion about a unipolar world, or what generally is called a rule based order, right? Which is basically the Western dominated world that we have, whether it's the SWIFT system, financial institutions, whether it's etc. So, can it be a a win-win world, which is actually BRICS, a Chinese thought in their documents and their relationships with African countries, through even these China-Africa summits, is the idea of win-win, right? So does my benefit, security or economic, has to be at your expense? And the answer is no, it doesn't have to be at that, right? There is a plan by the Russian Federation, for instance, that proposed a European-wide, because Russia is part of Europe as well, a European-wide security arrangement that was a win-win for everyone. One of the tenets is no security for one at the expense of another, right? All of them, small or large, should have the same right to security, win-win. So the problem is in the mentality, right? The problem is in the mentality. I don't know how long it's going to take, but the idea that you can have relationships based on win-win relationships is one that is not prevalent in the West. This is very much so, right? This is
But there
very
is a
much so.
choice, though. So China is here. Indians are growing. They're also expanding, with their economy. The next strong economy is going to be India, with the way I see it. So Africa having all these choices now shouldn't be stuck with the West if they actually don't want to. And then they can see that the West that also can see that we have choices to, align with other, China or India. And shouldn't they be forced to kind of compromise to that level?
It takes so initiative. History is made both by Africans in terms of their own agency, but also, what actions are European states and the United States, what actions are they going to take, right? And so take a small country like Nicaragua. That small country has achieved its sovereignty, it's independent, it decides for itself its foreign policy, who it allies with, it devises its own economic policy, and it requires that any relationship with another state, including the most powerful state in our hemisphere, which is the United States, has to be based upon equality, right? Just like it's in the UN system, that states are all equal. It's not based on GDP. It's not based on how industrialized you are, etc. And so I think it's a very important then to look at which African countries are going to devise charts moving ahead that requires that, right? And so look around Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. So these actually represent South Africa, right? Also pushes in terms of trying to have its own independence, its own foreign policy, as well. It's a heavyweight. Nigeria, unfortunately, is not in that boat. So you can go around to see the agency, which societies, for various sort of their own historical agency, have produced states, are producing leaderships that are actually asking for and demanding, not actually asking, but demanding really, equality,
Well, of course, it costs
respect of
quite a lot.
sovereignty.
Mali has to go through lots of trouble, although it is a way to go to be free. But then they also made it really hard to survive without them. Did you have any advice on that?
So if you look at the case of Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger, because they're asserting their right to be sovereign, because they want new economic relationships that allows them to actually get out of poverty, to create jobs, if that's a problem, and if that's a problem for Western states, that already tells you that they're not willing to engage in one of equality and in win-win relationships. So, for instance, in Niger, you have Chinese companies that are coming and they're establishing commercial relationships. They're not there for charity, they're there for business. They want to make money, profit. But can that be done in a way where tax revenues are generated sufficient to go to the central government, that sharing agreements are beneficial and designed in a way that allows for a level of development, etc., technological transfer that occurs within, let's say, the petrochemical industry, or it can be railway in Ethiopia in terms of technological transfer, on and on and on. So it already gives you a sense that, again, some countries And here we're just focusing really on the US and Western powers, France being the primary beneficiary of very neo-colonial arrangement in the so-called Francophone sphere in Africa, right? It's really unwilling to come to terms with the reality that African states are demanding political independence, economic independence, and including monetary. Their money should not be in the French central bank. They should not have to ask permission for the French central bank in order to spend their money. They should not be charged by the French central bank to take out their money, right? This is, you can't get any more neo-colonial than that. And so you can see this as a ray of hope. That's why many Africans were looking at these as illustrations then of the type of relationship that you're talking about. It doesn't, it's not anti West. It's not a cultural expression. It's simply asserting rights, right? The same rights that you would enjoy if you're in England or elsewhere, right? Sovereignty, the use of your resources, and relationships based upon equality, specifically international law, right? Just obey international law. Article 2 says sovereignty. Do not, do not uh, uh, step on my sovereignty, whether it's militarily or through economic tools, such as IMF loans, as an example. So I think we have some time to go, but in order to get there, it really requires also different states, African people, to create that condition for themselves. And if Western partners are willing to be partners, they can be huge beneficiaries, right? Africa is a billion plus, huge consumer market, huge resource market with key resources for high value added, particularly the electronic, robotics, information technology, quantum computing. Really, the economy of the future runs on resources that are located in significant amount within the African continent. So what kind of relationship then can you build? Security arrangements, same thing as well, based upon, again, mutually beneficial. All these are possible. The question is, who's coming to the table? The president of Namibia, talking to a German politician, told him, uh, you know, you Europeans, every time you come here, all you do is complain about China. But when the Chinese come here, they come to talk about business, right? Exactly. So I think it's more of come here, talk about business, what's going to benefit you, and let's see what we can find in common. That's it. It's simple. But the imperial mentality, the imperial mentality is a very real thing. And I think many American historians like Alfred McCoy, political scientists, are very much worried because while the British Empire had a soft landing, one can argue, right? And it was able to piggyback off of its child, which is the United States, and pretty much is fed, right? As kind of fed off of that by being a very good client, but fed off of that. The city of London, in terms of center of finance, and even the importance, right? I think it was a Chinese diplomat on BBC who was saying, look, the United Kingdom is a small island. It needs to behave like that, right? Again, this is an unfathomable thinking, but it's almost coming to this reality that we're in a new globe, a new age. And so there needs to be a recognition. You're not an empire, and there's a detriment to being an empire, both for the British people and then here for the United States, for Americans. We also are under significant political and economic and social turmoil because of this imperial project and imperial mentality. And so I think to your question regarding the nature of relationships with, let's say, African countries, or you could have changed Africa to Latin American countries, our neighbors, or you could have changed it to, let's say, Asian countries. Can it be based on win-win? Can it be based on the idea of equality and partnership? That requires a bit of a rude awakening. Um, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really sorry I actually talked too much of your time. I expected it to be shorter, but you do have lots of information and knowledge in this regard. So I'm pretty much finished my question, unless there's something that you want to add on it.
No, this was actually a really, really wonderful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity. I think if you do invite me another time, I think for particularly an Ethiopian audience, even an international audience, it would really, really be fruitful and interesting to have a conversation about Ethiopia's experimentation with development, right? Particularly the 10 years or so from 2002 moving forward. It was a window into a possible mechanism of industrialization. Um, and and so then the question can also be what went wrong, and just as important, where is Ethiopia today, particularly with the structural adjustment, the embrace of structural adjustment programs. Where is Ethiopia today? What's its future going to be? I think that would be an interesting conversation to have for me.
Thank you so much. I was actually going to ask you if you can come again, because I noticed that we need this kind of enlightenment, and the audience need to, we need to give him a lot of information in this regard, because we don't talk about it, and it is a very important subject that we need to deal with. So thank you very much. Hopefully you come back again. Thank you so much again for coming. I'm very, very grateful. It's been like an hour and 36 minutes. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much. The time went by so quick. It was a great conversation. The only thing I needed was some coffee, right? And it had been in a cafe.
It's going to be on me.
Okay, thank you.
Everyone, as you can see, the interview has ended here. I'm sure you enjoyed the interview and you got all this information. Now you can work on. If you've got any question, any comments, please email me on menaleshmeti@gmail.com. We finished here. Until next time, goodbye.